we are not relying on this information as our primary investigative information. The problem that we have in this case, we don't even know what this case really is. We're looking at rootless hairs, hoping that that gives us the information that we need. I wouldn't presume that the abduction was intentional. Perhaps there wasn't an intent to spend 40 minutes inside the house. We'll be looking at a video where there was what I think was a flower pot or a can or something that was used to prop open the door near the kitchen at the back of the house. Why would that door be propped open?
Hey guys, it's Jackson Buhai here at TMZ, your host of In the Know. We have reached the 4-month mark officially since Nancy Guthrie was initially abducted. Savannah Guthrie coming out recently correcting misleading reports saying that she had hired private investigators, also expressing the sheer amount of grief she's experiencing right now, having it be 4 months without seeing her mom or knowing where she's been. Today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Valentin. He's the chair of the Forensic Science Department at the University of New Haven, who's saying that Savannah Guthrie should keep her head up during the investigation, and he's here today to tell us why. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jackson.
Of course. So you subscribe to the idea that the investigation is far from over. We have some people in the investigative community calling this a cold case, and others like you saying that the investigation's far from done. Why is that?
So, I'm aware of a lot of forensic techniques that are being used that they still hold promise, and we won't know until we get the results of that forensic testing. And what I'm hopeful for is that the results of those forensic testing, will lead the investigation in new directions. Right? What we're starving for here is a name. We're starving for information that will help us make sense of what I'm sure is just a large amount of data. Right? There's cell phone tower information. There's license plate reader information. There's surveillance footage of all sorts of things, and what we just don't know is who are we looking for, and when was that information of value? Was it 12 hours before? Was it 2 hours before? Was it 2 hours afterward? And all we need is a kernel of information, a name, and perhaps something from those forensic testing results will give us a name that will help us cull through all of that data and propel this investigation forward. And
what kind of data sets are we looking at here?
So, the easiest thing would be to say that, every cell phone in the vicinity of that house is hitting a tower, and it's registering to that tower. So the investigators surely have that information. They know which phones, and they're holding on to it, and they'll certainly have looked at it in some measure. Are these phones that have been hitting the same tower for the last 6 months? Are there phones that have only been hitting the tower for the last week? Are there phones that only hit the tower twice and have never come, back to those same towers ever again? There's a lot of information to be had, right? Because now you can distinguish between residents and people who've just, traveled through the area once. And that can be helpful. License plate readers, right? Your cars are getting picked up all the time as they travel through different areas. And is that information helpful? Now, how do you distinguish somebody just driving through a neighborhood versus the person of interest? We need a name. We need some bit of information to grab onto because, this is such an immense amount of information that it's hard to know what you're looking for until you get something to, again, grab onto.
There are a lot of people that say that investigators are dealing with the opposite of such a high volume of information. Nancy Guthrie lived in a very secluded area. There were not a lot of CCTV cameras around the roads where that car that potentially took her was traveling. The person in the Ring doorbell footage, for example, is theorized to have a radio instead of a cell phone on him, making it difficult for cell phone towers to ping his phone. When there aren't those data sets to reference, what are investigators left with really if we are dealing with a person that thought ahead and thought through all the possible places that he could have been tracked and covered his tracks subsequently? What are they left with?
Well, Jackson, you're right, because normally we are not relying on this information as our primary, investigative information, because what do we normally have? We have a relationship between our victim and our offender that we can uncover relatively easily. So we're not left to use cell phone information as the primary method for establishing the relationship or the connection. What we're actually using that information for is corroborating that connection, right? So if we know the relationship between the victim and the offender, then what we do is we use the cell phone information that we search for, because now we know the name, and now we can corroborate, well, we know you were at the house between midnight and 2:30 because we found your phone number hitting off that tower. We have your license plate on a reader, or in the vicinity between this time and that time. But how did we find it? Because we knew what we were looking for. How did we know what we were looking for? Because we understood the relationship. And so it's a means to an end. It's a way of understanding how you're going to access the information that you have available to you. The problem that we have in this case is that we don't even know what this case really is. We don't know if it's a kidnapping that's gone wrong. We don't know if it was, well, a kidnapping gone wrong. We don't know if it was a burglary that's turned into a kidnapping. We don't know if it was a targeted kidnapping of Nancy Guthrie herself. We simply don't know. And when you don't know what your case is really about, you also have a difficult situation when you don't know how to search for evidence. And I'm going to say, you probably made mistakes at the scene in searching for evidence because you didn't know what kind of case you had. And the analogy that I use very often in this regard is, imagine a stage where you're in control of the lights. And if I said you had a domestic homicide, you would turn the lights on in particular parts of your stage, right? Your scene, because those areas are important. And if you instead say, hey, we have a home invasion, some of the lights go off and different lights go on because different areas of your scene take on different importance. And because we don't know what kind of case this is, we're really grasping at where the evidence was in that house. And as a result, what we're finding ourselves with, we have precious little physical evidence to work with. Now, was there physical evidence in the house? Undoubtedly. The question is, was it recovered? And the reason why we're looking at rootless hairs, and we're hoping that gives us the information that we need, is because initially that what this case was about was not well understood. And here we are 4 months later, still not really understanding what this case is about. And so now we're trying to wring as much information as possible from the little bit of physical evidence that we have.
He's in that house for over 40 minutes after we see him on that doorbell footage. What is someone that is going to abduct an older individual in that house for 40 minutes? I mean, are they staging a crime scene, or is the abductee being problematic for the perpetrator? In your experience, why would someone stay that long inside the crime scene?
I would take it one step behind where you're starting from, and I wouldn't presume that the abduction was intentional. And perhaps there wasn't an intent to spend 40 minutes inside the house. Now, I remember, several months ago, looking at a video where there was what I think was a flower pot or a can or something that was used to prop open the door near the kitchen at the back of the house. And it was my understanding that that was there at the very beginning. Why would that door be propped open? Now, this is one of those things where context means everything. Now, in any other situation, having a door propped open wouldn't mean much of anything. But in a situation where you're trying to make sense of what your scene is about, a simple, otherwise innocuous condition within your scene, such as a door being propped open, takes potentially outsized importance. Because if you had taken that photo to the members of Nancy Guthrie's family and say, hey, is this something unusual? And you show them the photo of that door being propped open, and they were to tell you that door would never be propped open, or that door would always be locked, or that door closes on its own, so there's no reason for that to be that way. Now you know that otherwise innocuous pot, plant, object, whatever it was holding the door open, now is a very important piece of physical evidence, because whoever put that there is somebody far into that environment, right? And now there's your source potentially for fingerprints and for DNA or other trace evidence. But the issue is, can you find the places within that environment where there was a disturbance, right? A change in, the normal condition within the house. And what inexperienced or investigators without a rich vocabulary will often say is that there was a sign of a disturbance, signs of a struggle. Well, what does that mean when your victim, your abductee potentially, is an 84-year-old woman? There might not be any, recognizable sign of struggle because she's so easily subdued, right? It might have been, clearly she was bleeding at some point, but that might be the only actual tangible evidence of the struggle that we presume occurs in this abduction. The only other signs of disturbance or alteration to the scene might be what you alluded to, which is their attempts to bring the scene back to its normal state. But inevitably, they're going to stage it or return it incorrectly. And this is where you'd want to, and I've done this in casework before, where you actually show family members or people within a knowledge of the environment, hey, does this look normal to you? Does this look right? And they'll be able to point out to you that no, that shouldn't be there. No, she would never leave this there. And now you can hone in on those objects because now you can presume or you hope that those are objects that have been touched or handled by your perpetrators. Because you really don't have any other, the only other places where you can say with any degree of confidence, where were the offenders? They were at your path of entry and your path of egress, right? Which way did they come in and which way did they leave? And aside from those two places, you have no idea where they were.
Based on the information we have at hand, I want to start by referencing the doorbell footage. He walks up to the door, he tries the handle, door's locked. Notices the camera's filming him, turns around, tries to cover up the camera with some shrubs from the front yard. We know the back door is propped open. The question that I have is, was that back door propped open beforehand or after the fact? What makes the most sense to you in this case, just purely based off the information we have in front of us?
So if it is a planned abduction where you run under the assumption that we have more than one participant, the back door is propped open to make it easier for the second participant to gain access to the house, or it's easier for them to take Nancy out of the house. Now that's an assumption because is it potentially easier for her to be taken out through the front? Right? The blood evidence in the front of the house certainly makes it seem like she was taken out of the front of the house. I don't even want to say that. I know she was there at some point, but I don't even want to say that means she was taken out. She could have been brought to the front of the house, brought back through the house, and then exited through the rear of the house. We can only say she was at the front of the house for a period of time, right? But we've seen those photographs of the blood stains, what they're called are drip stains, and they're not particularly useful in terms of reconstruction, other than to tell you where somebody was or where an object was with blood on it after the bloodletting event occurred, right? After the bleeding starts and something has blood on it. Almost always it's the person who's bleeding, but every now and then it's actually an object that has the person's blood on it. So yes. And so you always want to carve out that option that, hey, it might not be the person, it might be an object with the person's blood on it, just in case. But this is where a person who's very adept at documenting scenes would have taken a moment to document, does the door that's being propped open close on its own? Right? So if we take away that object that is propping the door open, what happens? Does the door close? Or is it simply a matter of, there's a breeze and the breeze might make the door close? Because that's important information, right? Because it potentially indicates that somebody has prior knowledge about what that door does. So we immediately want to grab that and prop the door open. Now, a lot of this is speculative, of course, right? Because we're trying to make sense of behavior that we really have a very limited window into. But we're trying to make sense of why are people doing what it is that they're doing while they're in the scene. And when you are looking, and so obviously as a forensic scientist who's trying to use this as a detective, right? Physical evidence is my what I traffic and what my stock and trade in is, right? I'm looking for ways to utilize physical evidence because it is the most powerful evidence if it's properly interpreted. And so when I go to scenes, I'm trying to make sense of what could this event have been. And that inevitably leads me to the sources of the physical evidence. And so if these Pima County investigators went to that scene and they never thought of what could this be, or even worse, they settled on only one version of the events. And that's what happens a lot. The investigators, especially experienced ones, think they know so much, or I've seen this before, I've handled, hundreds of cases. And they kind of close off the possibility that A, they could be wrong, or B, that, other people within their unit also have good ideas. And so they only look at cases one way. And so inevitably, they only collect evidence for one version of what could have happened. Now, I don't know whether or not that's at play here, but clearly we're starving for physical evidence.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. You've given us some extremely informative insight. I appreciate your time today.
No, it's my pleasure, Jackson.